Alright, in this video we are going to add Gamepad support to our core input system. So that means we're going to need to turn our attention over here to our input class. Before I do that, we're starting to get a little bit of clutter up here in our environment.
Time to close some stuff.
We'll close out the player index, we'll close out the keys, and that gives us a good bit of room. So again, we're jumping back over here. This is our input code file and it has all of our core input elements. Now the first thing we're going to need to do in here is we're going to need to address our map set class, because all of a sudden we've now introduced the idea of gamepad input. In order to make gamepad input bindable and readable by the input system, we need a dictionary to translate the incoming button presses to internal named inputs for the game.
Sure.
And the other thing we need to consider is that the keyboard was easy because the keyboard was only one device.
Right. Therefore one dictionary.
And therefore only one dictionary. With the gamepad, however, we can have up to 4 controllers. And we want to have each one having its own set of inputs, all of which can be bound, which means we need 4 dictionaries, 1 dictionary per controller.
So player 2 might like a certain drum to be played on the Y button as opposed to the B button, and you want to be able to map that sort of thing.
Exactly. So we're going to put together a series of dictionaries. So what we're actually going to do is create an array of dictionaries.
Okay.
So we'll start out, we'll add a new field into mapset, and that is going to be a public dictionary array. So we'll start out with dictionary, and the types used here will be the same as with our key map. We're going to be using an integer type for the key inside of the dictionary, and that will be resulting in an input data value. So the value type will be input data. The difference here is the fact that this dictionary is an array, so we have some very important square braces that will be added to the end of this definition.
Yeah, don't forget those.
Now this dictionary array is going to be called Gamepad Maps. And even though it's a small change, this is plural in contrast to key map, which was just one. Gamepad Maps means that this isn't just one gamepad map, it's all 4 of them.
Okay.
So instead of gamepad maps being equal to a new dictionary, it's going to be equal to a new dictionary array. So that's new dictionary of type int by input data. And then we once again need some small but significant square braces to say that there are going to be 4 such elements for our 4 dictionaries.
Meaning, yeah, 4 dictionaries, right. And
let's see, we have, glancing down here, gamepad maps, make sure we use our equals to assign all of this over, and that takes care of the creation of gamepad maps. Now another interesting thing that can be a little bit tricky at first is the fact that we have not actually created any dictionaries at this point.
Right.
We have created an array that can hold dictionaries. That means before we put this map set into use, we need to make sure that we get those dictionaries created so that we can begin storing bindings in them. So what we're going to do is we will add a constructor to our mapset class. So we'll specify the parameterless constructor here. So we'll say public mapset. The idea here is that whenever a mapset class gets instantiated, we want to go through and walk through this array, through our gamepad maps array, and drop a new instance of a dictionary into each element. So we'll jump in here with a for loop. We'll just use the standard template for a for loop, hit tab, do create it, and then loop over the length of our gamepad maps. So gamepad maps dot length, which of course that will end up being 4 iterations. And then for each iteration, we will take the current gamepad map, so gamepad maps sub I, and we will instantiate a new dictionary with the proper types. And
so now each one of those indices within your array now has a dictionary inside of it.
Right, so we actually, at this point, will have created 4 dictionaries. So that means later when we go to address these, we already have dictionaries in place.
It's like a box set of dictionaries that has like 4 volumes in it.
Exactly. I'm also going to take out the curly braces, since there's only 1 line in this for statement, and that will keep the code a little bit more concise. Alright, now that we've added the necessary storage capacity to our map set, let's turn our attention to the input class, and let's get it set up to manage gamepad input. down here inside of initialize, inside of our gamepad class, let's establish some listeners for gamepad input. So we can look into the gamepad input class, as in gamepad. There we go, gamepad input. If we look into that class, we see we have button press and button release. Let's look at button release first, hit plus equals to create a new listener, so we'll tab out twice, and then we'll get both the new instance of a button notice delegate as well as the method itself.
Very cool.
Then we'll do the same thing, we'll jump up a line, we'll look at gamepad input again, look for button press, plus equals, tab out twice, and we get our second handler.
It's like cheating.
So, since there are going to be quite a few handlers inside of this input class, we'll drop down a simple comment to say that these are for the gamepad. Then we'll also, just to patch up the ordering of things that are happening inside of the input class, I'm going to take both of these handler methods and we'll cut them so that we can move them down here below keyboard, just so that visually everything makes sense. So we have our keyboard handling section followed by our gamepad handling section, just the same way that we have the gamepad events following the keyboard events. Alright, now we can jump down to the event handlers and code in the actual handler themselves. So this will be the code that says, alright, we've got a button incoming. Let's look into the dictionary that's relevant, and then let's pass out an input pressed or input released event where relevant. So the first thing we'll do is we'll create a local input data variable. Call that input data. And once again, we'll be using try get value with our dictionaries, so that if we do in fact find the incoming button, we'll store the resulting input data into input data, and then can proceed to fire the event. So let's put together our call to our gamepad map. So we need to look into our current map set. And if we look into that, we'll see that we now have gamepad maps in addition to key map. Now if we look at gamepad maps, the thing to remember here is that gamepad maps now contains multiple dictionaries. So instead of directly saying dot, we actually need to address a specific element. And this is where player index comes into play. Since we've got, as part of the button notice method signature, we're passed a player index to say which controller this came from, we'll map that player index into our gamepad dictionary array, and that way we'll pull a specific binding based on the controller that we're looking at. This is the association between a physical controller and a specific input mapping dictionary.
And this is just like what we did over in the gamepad input class with the last pad state.
Exactly. We've got a player index that's addressing something in an array, so all we're going to do is take that player index and cast it over to integer. Then we can successfully address the element of the array. And now, if we hit dot and look into that, we are looking into a specific gamepad map. And we can prove that by saying one of the methods inside of a dictionary is try get value, and there we go. So we've got try get value, and we need to specify what thing we're looking for as a key, and that is going to be a button. Now, of course, button is an enumeration element, so we'll have to cast that over to int to satisfy the key type of the dictionary. And now we can specify an out variable for the input data if found. And so we'll say out input data to be able to store that out into our input data variable. Then we can finish off our call to try get value. And if this did indeed come back as true, then we can fire off the input pressed event. So we'll say input pressed, and if this worked, we've already loaded an input data struct out of the dictionary, so we'll pass that along here using the input data variable.
Gotcha.
And so, once again, just a quick review, since there's quite a few things going on, including one parenthesis that I left out. Because we had the parenthesis that was used in try get value, and then the final one to close off the if statement. So looking at it, just quick review, we've got current map set is all of our maps. Gamepad maps are our 4 controller maps. we grab a specific controller map by player index, and then with that map, so that map is now a dictionary. So that is a dictionary that we address. We give in an integer number of a button, and if that exists, we get an input data out. So we run try get value. The button is what we use for the key in the dictionary, and then if that key is found, output the input data value to our input data variable.
Gotcha.
So if that is indeed found, then try get value returns true. That causes us to jump into our if statement, and there we fire off the input pressed event.
Feeding it the input data.
Exactly. So now we'll do the exact same thing inside of Gamepad input button release. So we'll copy all of this code. We'll jump in here and paste it into button release, and everything should be exactly the same except for the fact that we generate an input released event. So we've got input released, passing in the input data. So that takes care of our input handlers. Now there's one last thing we need to make sure that we remember to put in, and this is a small but very significant element in this chain of calls that has to occur.
Well, if we're going to go like we did with the keyboard, we now need to update.
Exactly, because unless the Gamepad input class is told to check for updates, it's never going to, and therefore it will never generate events.
Right, but updating is interesting here because you got to remember we're not just calling update, we've actually got to feed it a player.
Exactly, and we're not just calling a single update, we're needing to call update 4 times, once per controller. So in order to do that, we're just going to loop for the number of Gamepad maps we currently have listed. So we'll make a for loop, just a basic for loop, tab twice, drop in the template, and then for the number of iterations, we'll feed in current map set dot gamepad maps dot length. And so we have 4 gamepad maps, and therefore we will loop 4 times. And so for each iteration of the loop, we will call gamepad input dot update. So we'll recall the same method over and over again, except that we will pass in the current player that needs to be updated. And since we're inside of a for loop, that's actually given by our index variable. We'll pass in I. So we'll update players 0, 1, 2, and 3. Now naturally this is an enumeration element, so we need to cast this integer over to a player index value.
Gotcha.
And once we do that, we're only going to have a single statement inside of this for loop, so I'm going to pull out the curly braces.
Okay.
So now I've got 1 call to keyboard update and 4 calls to gamepad.update. We pass along a specific controller.
So at this point, you should be ready to take in some inputs saved from the XML file. We would just need to add those inputs into the XML.
Right, we'd have to add them to the XML, and also keep in mind that currently our configuration class only considers key binding. So we still got a few things to consider.
But we're close.
But we do have everything we need to take care of inside of input. We've now enhanced our input system so that it is gamepad aware and has the necessary handler functionality.
Very nice. So that is going to wrap things up for this video. Thanks.